I would like to introduce you. A lot of you people already know Roger Newman. He's a longtime Ashby Village member and member of the Science and Ideas interest group. He has given us several talks on different subjects. So I've introduced him several times. He's been a professor at the Peralta colleges for 30 to 40 years, most recently at Berkeley City College. And so he is a well-known entity around here. I am going to mute everyone now. And when you are ready to make a contribution, you can either write something on the chat, which is down at the bottom, or you can raise your hand in the participants list, or you can do like this, but that's less likely. Okay, so here we go. There you go, Roger.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and thanks for tuning in today. Beautiful day, and I hope we aren't going to miss too much sunshine by sitting in front of our computers for another hour and a half. But anyway, so I just wanted to say a little bit about my interest in names and some of the different kinds of things that we'll be looking at. I mean, there's so many topics around names that it's really a fascinating issue. Can I share screen, Audrey?
Yes, you can.
Am I a co-host?
Oh, I'm not sure if I made you a co-host. I will just
I think I need that.
make sure that
No, I think you can do it anyhow.
You can do it anyhow?
I think so. That's what we've been learning.
Okay, well, I'll give it a try.
Okay, I just made you a co-host.
Okay, so there's me, Jolly Roger, up there. Okay, so anyway, just to start out, what's in a name? Of course, this is a quote from Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. And I'm sure there's people here who know a lot more about Shakespeare than I do, but what I, in my cursory look at the quote, apparently it has to do with the different families that they came from, and the reason that their romance was not allowed was because they came from these two different families, the Capulets and the Montagues. And so the issue here is that we just love each other, and who cares what our names are? You know, we don't have to care about our names. And of course, they did have to care about their names because everybody else cared about it. And so, you know, it's just an interesting phenomenon that the name really has a lot of power. And so we're going to take a look at some different aspects of naming. So this is a little bit of an overview of what we're going to try to do today. I want to talk about the many fascinating topics related to names, and then we have Dr. Marty Schiffenbauer, who is agreed to talk a bit about Eastern European Jewish names, and we'll have discussion, and people can ask questions or chime in their experiences. Dr. Joan Stromanis, Ashby Village member, is talk about names as social indicators. Stories of names, so we're going to have some time. I thought with the stories we could kind of intersperse it along the way, so that it's not just, you know, talking heads, you know, back. So we get more time for people to contribute. If there's time, I'd like to get into the question of scientific names, genus and species, since we are the Science and Ideas group. And there's a lot of interesting things about that, but I'm not sure we'll get into that, but I'd like to. And then finally, some issues about names. And these are just some things I'd like people to kind of give some thought to, and maybe we'll have time to discuss it. It was a surprise to me that people objected to the reference to our new First Lady as Dr. Jill Biden. And I was kind of you know, to me, this is a wonderful thing that we have somebody with a doctorate as First Lady, and somebody who has a profession, is going to continue to be a teacher while she's First Lady. And you know, it doesn't, what wife has a PhD and it doesn't bother me one bit, you know, so anyway, I find that odd, but I'm sure there's something I'm not getting. Another question, what power do negative nicknames have? You know, we've had a really trying experience in the last several years of certain people using these negative nicknames, you know, Crooked Hillary or Sleepy Joe. And I just think it's very interesting, the power of that terminology, that really does hurt. And I think one of the things was it kind of came on during the, when the Republicans were choosing their candidate back in 16, I guess it was, that Trump got a lot of mileage out of that. So I'm curious about how does that work? What is the cost of having a, quote, black name? We don't have time to really get into African-American naming conventions. They're very, very interesting. There's I think it's arguably the most creative side of naming that we see today. And but in doing a little research, I found out that it's actually costs. It's harder to get an interview. It's harder to get a job if you have a, quote, black name like Latanya or LaShonda or something like that. And then Charlie Tart, who's a member of our group and has given talks before, hopefully we'll have time to hear him. Do names influence our behavior? And the Latin quote here, nomen est omen. So the name is a omen, we think of as a warning or a signal. So apparently there's this field within psychology of nominative determinism. So that'll make it sound more scientific. So that'll be fun. So anyway, let me just throw in a little fun thing here. This is a category of namings called aptonyms. And these are names that seem to be appropriate. And we had some of you may remember if you've been here a long time, Herb Cain was a columnist for the San Francisco Chronicle from 1938 to 1990 with a couple of timeouts. And he had this thing where he would make up these name freaks, or sometimes they're real people. So Mr. Fill-In as a substitute teacher, Patience Scales, a piano teacher, Shelby Goldgrab, a tax accountant, Mike Kafka, Guantanamo prison guard. And the one that I know actually is a true name is Cardinal Sin, which I could hardly believe it, but he was a long time a very powerful Catholic Archbishop of Manila. His name was Sin, and he rose to the position of cardinal. And then of course, Click and Clack, you look up Click and Clack staff credits, and I recommend sometime when you need a laugh, because it goes on and on and on. I mean, this is just a sample, but here's his director of top secret security, Donatello Nobody. His drug trial specialist, Placebo Domingo. And his eBay specialist, Selma Junkoff. I'm all shook up. Elvis impersonator. C.S. Verdad, fact checker, Mexico City office. Natalie Attired, fashion consultant. Here's my favorite is Poupon de Grasse, French dog walker. Read a manual, pal, the help desk supervisor. Whoop. I guess we got somebody's dog upset with Poupon de Grasse.
Right.
So anyway, there's a bunch of them there. You talking to me?
Roger, will you unmute yourself? Roger?
Did I get muted?
You're not muted now.
Okay. So anyway, Nina Cajones, self-defense coach. Count de Monet, senior accountants, Paris office. And of course, the one that they had probably for the longest time, their legal team, Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe. So you can have a lot of fun with names. And, you know, just a few kind of topics here. Naming patterns in different cultures. If you read that little article I sent around, it has to do with a lot of things about how different cultures use names in different ways. I think the thing that was striking to me and has been striking in a number of communications I've gotten from other people is the degree to which we're sort of stuck in our bureaucracies. And so people who want to change their names, you know, this is like a big deal. You know, how can you change your name? Because, you know, then, you know, you have to change it in all these different bureaucracies and let everybody know and get a different driver's license and so on and so forth. But in a lot of cultures, you know, that's, you know, there's no bureaucracy and you don't have a problem. In some places, people get around it by using nicknames. Down here, I put pseudonyms, nicknames. So you might just have your bureaucratic name, and then just, you know, you can change your nickname when you feel like it. So that's a, you know, one way to do it. Name taboos. I'll just tell you briefly about this story with the Yanomami. These are people in southern Venezuela and northern Brazil, and they're one of the, you know, last contacted tribes in South America, a very big group of people. And Napoleon Chagnon was the anthropologist who, from University of Michigan, who went there and studied them and so on. And they had a taboo against using the personal names, especially for older people or you know, people with, you know, of respect. Children, not so, it wasn't so big deal, but so you could refer to somebody as so-and-so's father, that would be okay. But, you know, his name, you're never supposed to use his name because it implies that you have some power over him. So of course, anthropologists, they're trying to construct kinship charts, family trees, and figure out who's related to whom. It's a big deal. You do that in any culture you go to. So Napoleon Chagnon's going around asking them, well, what's that guy's name? And what's this person's name? And they were just so embarrassed, you know, like, well, gosh, we can't tell you that. I mean, that, you know, that would really be awful. And so they whisper it to him, you know, he'd write it down, you know. And then he would say it out loud and everybody would crack up laughing. And so, you know, they said, what's so funny about why are you laughing? And they were giving him these ridiculous names, you know, like hairy penis or something, you know, it would just be this name that would, you know, they just crack up. And so he had to throw out a whole year's worth of work because they were giving him these crazy names. So the whole name thing is really fraud. It's important, you know, people care about their names. And so anyway, let's just, one final thing. I just wanted to say, in looking up about names, I found out that if you put in a search for a name, whatever name it is, origin search, you'll get information. So I put in Roger name origin, and boom, I get this. The given name derived from Old French of Germanic origin, derived from the elements, crud, croby, fame, renown, and god or gerd, spear or a lance. So this was a name introduced into England by the Normans during the Norman invasion. So it's a Norse name, and it was important in the Normans. And so then I thought, well, why is it used in radio talk when they say Roger over and out, or Roger Wilco, or, you know, these kind of things. And so I found out that it originates from the practice of people using, sending telegrams, that they would use the R to stand for received. And then when it morphed into spoken radio during World War II, the phonetic alphabet equivalent word was Roger. So the R means received. Okay, so that's interesting. And you can go on and, you know, find all kinds of stuff. But just a little tip, if you want to know where a particular name comes from, that's the way to do it. And just one other point, I was always chagrined that I could never find a Saint Roger or a King Roger, or, you know, like, how come everybody else, you know, they can know about these, you know, names that are famous, you know, King Charles, Prince Charles, so on. Never anything with Roger. So several years ago, Audrey and I traveled to Sicily in southern Italy. And lo and behold, we found out that there was Roger the First and Roger the Second. I thought, oh, okay. And when we went to under the church in this big cathedral, we found this mural. And this is a picture of King Roger II being crowned by nobody less than Jesus Christ himself. So I guess that kind of puts me on the map, you know, like, or at least my name. And here it says in Greek, it says Rogerius Rex. So anyway, finally got a little bit of indication. So, okay, so I'm gonna stop share there. That's enough of that. And I'd like to introduce Marty, and Marty's there, yeah, okay, great. And I'll just say, I asked Marty, I've known Marty for several years. He's quite a well-known character around Berkeley. And so some of you may have met him before. But I asked him to do this because he grew up in an Orthodox family in Brooklyn and attended yeshiva through high school. So he has a strong background in Jewish culture. He got a PhD from NYU in experimental psychology. And he's lived in Berkeley since about 1967 and was quite active in Berkeley politics in the late 70s and early 80s. So he's a known character around here, and he considers himself today a Jewish atheist. So, I asked him to say a little bit about Eastern European or Ashkenazi names, and then we can have time for questions and stories and so on. So Marty, want to give us some thoughts?
Okay, it's rare that I'm referred to as doctor. And usually it's when I get a family invitation to a bar mitzvah, a wedding, and it's addressed as doctor. And that's the whole Jill Biden thing. I sort of felt I should now, in protest, always sign off as doctor, but I decided not to. Anyway, I took a couple of notes. I'm by no means an expert on Jewish names, but since you asked, Roger, I did some research. And stop me if I go on too long. So first of all, why did Jews get surnames? And it was basically because the governments wanted to tax them and to draft the men. And so they they required them to get surnames called by their Yiddish names and the son or daughter of. So, for example, my name would be Yechiel Mechel ben Moshe, and that's in Yiddish. And two angels, Yechiel and Michael in Hebrew, it would be Yechiel and Michael. And my father's name was Moshe. And if I would get called up to the Torah when I used to go to synagogue for an aliyah, when they were reading the Torah, that's how they would call me up, Yechiel Mechel ben Moshe. And I guess there are a whole bunch of other stuff with Jewish names. I was taught in yeshiva that when you die, you go up to the Jewish pearly gates, and the first thing they ask you is, hey, what's your name? And since you're going to be very nervous, you might forget your name. So there were two phrases that I was taught, and the beginning of each phrase has the same initial letter as my name, and I still remember them after all these years. And so for Yechiel, it's Yemenad Hashem Romema, Yemenad Hashem Osachael, and for Michael, it's Matovu Alecha Yaakov Mishkan Osecha Yisrael. That's in Hebrew. So if indeed there is a Jewish pearly gates, I'm ready. Then I should also say, with prohibitions about names, now this was actually true I grew up, now they call it modern Jewish Orthodox, which is, very observant, but not Hasidic. And when I grew up, it was tradition, or it was forbidden really, to marry a woman that had the same Jewish name as your mother. And I remember going to summer camp, and there was a case, one of the counselors fell in love with one of the women counselors, and they were going to get married, but unfortunately, her name was the same as this guy's mother.
Oh dear.
Somehow they figured out a way to get around that. And I don't think the tradition holds much now in modern Orthodox, but it definitely holds it with Hasidim. And I don't know, they can figure out ways by changing names and stuff like that. And it also less so holds for fathers' names, for a woman to marry a guy whose name is the same as their father's, but that was never as strict. Now, when did Jews take names? Now, some Germans decided pretty much as early as the 17th century to take names. I mean, they wanted to assimilate, and so they took surnames, similar to other German names. But for the Eastern European Jews, it happened later, and it was a requirement. In the German case, they really weren't required to do so. And what I have here, that the process that in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was pretty much in control of Poland and where I came from, and probably many of Ashkenazi Jews came from, was controlled by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And that was started in about 1787. I had a date, but probably the late 18th century. And in Russia, it was a little bit later. And the date I saw, Tsarist Russia, was 1844. So middle of 19th century. And so what names did Jews take? Many just took a name based on their Yiddish name. So for example, the son of Mendel would be Mendelssohn. The son of Abraham would be Abramson or Abramovich. And the son of Menashe would be Manischewitz, which we all know, the matzah manufacturer, and wine, of course. So other names were place names. So if your guy came from, or family came from Minsky, they would, came from Minsk, they would call themselves Minsky, or from Pinsk, it would be Pinsky. Then Click and Clack, if Click and Clack was around then, who knows what kind of names Jews would have had. And then there were, of course, profession names. Tailor would be Nudelmann, a butcher would be Fleischer, and that's Fleisch is German for meat. Some of the more famous Jewish names, the famous Jewish family Bronfman, they were in the liquor trade, which of course they are, in famous Canadian family. And for teacher would be Lehrer. Then names from nature, there were some Jews who take names from nature, like Applebaum for apple tree. And then there are another bunch of sources for names. Some took names from the Bible. Now, one very, very important name was Cohen, and Cohen as well as Levi. And that's directly from the Bible. And Cohen means high priest, and Levi is the sort of assistant. And there are variations like Katz for Cohen or Levine for Levi. And I was surprised to learn when I did this research that Cohen is actually the most common name in Israel, the most common Jewish name. And, you know, a lot of names, and I'll talk about it a little later, Jewish names were changed once they got to the US or, you know, England or wherever left, you know, their statal. And, but Cohen was hardly ever changed, and it has a certain prestige, you know, hey, you're related to the high priest. And Levine also has a certain prestige. And when you call people up to the Torah, the first two aliyahs, the first one is for the Cohen and the second is for the Levi. And although now Cohen is so common in Israel, it was not that common when I grew up in Brooklyn. So often if you had a minyan of a bunch of people, there weren't many Cohens. So they would always be getting aliyahs. And the poor non-Cohens and non-Levites, maybe every month you'd get an aliyah. And I was always quite jealous. And, you know, I remember once asking, you sure we're not Cohens? You sure we're not Cohens? My grandfather, no, he said, no, we're not Cohens. And there's also been a lot of studies looking at the Y chromosome, because being a Cohen, if your father was a Cohen, you're a Cohen, which is very different from whether you're Jewish. The tradition is among Orthodox Jews that if your mother was Jewish, you're Jewish. It's a maternal line. But for Cohens and Levites, it's the paternal line. And now, of course, Reform Jews have changed that. But in Israel, you can't, you know, you're not accepted as a Jew. If your father was a Jew, but your mother wasn't, you'd have to convert. And it's very tough, I should say, in Israel to get certified as a Jew. And the Orthodox pretty much run, the Orthodox rabbis run a lot of the civil laws and civil marriage and other stuff in Israel. So the studies would be of the Y chromosome to see if there's some commonality among people whose name is Cohen or a variation like Katz. And initially it was thought, yeah, there is some common markers among the Cohens. But then there were other studies that indicated maybe not, maybe it's just the Middle Eastern marker. So that's still quite controversial. Also, there's a complication because it's prestigious to be a Cohen. Many people might have just said, hey, if they moved from one town to another, hey, I'm a Cohen, and who would know really? It's hard to know. So they're still looking at it. Now, there are also other, you know, there's a lot of long Jewish names and sort of sounding Polish or European. And I couldn't find the derivation of those. I imagine that there would be, you know, some people just took Polish names or whatever. That's, I suppose if I did more research, I'd find out. Like, you know, long names like Kusavitsky and stuff like that. Now, I did, I asked a few of my friends on a recent Zoom, you know, there were 3 on this Zoom who were Jewish, and all of them had names changed. One's name, he sort of thought it was something like Yonavitsky or so Yonakowski, and it was changed to Gordon. And it was a family lore that whoever took that name, you know, they said, well, what's your name? And they saw a sign or a billboard for Gordon's Gin, and they decided, hey, well, I'll call myself Gordon. Another one had a long Polish name that started with a G, and they ended up changing it to Gray, which is pretty simple. Another friend changed the name, simply removed the OV from the end of the name. But also there was some, this happened in the 80s, and I had a friend who is the son of a famous author, Irving Wallace, and he decided he wanted to go back to the original family name, Walachinsky. And in fact, he did change that. And that's his name. He authored many books himself. Most people believe that a lot of Jews had their name changed at Ellis Island. And from what I read, that wasn't really the case. The names were changed afterwards. But there is a story, you know, that some of you may have heard of, like the Jew's name is Sean Ferguson, and which is not a very Jewish name. And how did that Jew get it? Well, he was at Ellis Island, and he was asked, "What's your name?" And he had forgotten the name they gave him in Poland. So he said in Yiddish, "Ich hab Sean Ferguson." And so he said, "Oh yeah, Sean Ferguson." That's an old line. I guess I also read in that there was Jews would change their names early on, pretty much. Well, many Jews would change their names, but that's been declining since the 60s. And I guess, like I said, my friend David Wallace changed his name back, and so there's I guess a sort of ethnic identity, and the whole, you know, it's all changed. Now, a lot of people in Israel, of course, they changed their name, and they changed often, like Ben Gurion, they changed their, you know, name that they had, a family name in Poland, to be the son of or the daughter of, which was very Israeli. And now, I should say that there's a lot of research on Jewish names, and you probably not be surprised. It's very controversial as to, and I'm just moving down on my screen here. There's even one of the books that people have used to look at the history of Jewish names. And I'm trying to find the name here. It's a dictionary of Jewish names and their history by Ben-Zion C. Kaganov. And people were using that in one article in Slate that was, you know, got a lot of readers, used that as a reference. And then all of a sudden, all these scholars said, this guy is wrong and he made all these mistakes. So again, among Jews, you know, there's always, everything tends to be controversial. I hope people don't think I'm being anti-Semitic. So talk a little bit about my own name, which is Schiffenbauer. And it was not changed from the European name, because I know I looked at when my father came over in 1908, and Schiffenbauer was on the manifest. And you know, I looked and I could never find the, you know, something that, you know, definitive as to how my ancestors got that name or took that name. I assume Schiffenbauer means boat builder in German, and it's quite possible that someone in my family long ago was involved in boat building. And it makes a little bit of sense because on my father's side of the family, there are quite a few scientists, and they weren't like in other trades that maybe Jews had in the shtetl. And so, and my paternal grandfather, who I never met, and he actually died in the Spanish flu in 1918. He was a teacher, and I have, you know, really surprised me. If you do Google Schiffenbauer, and there's quite a few scientists, chemists, engineers, you name it. And I guess experimental psychology is kind of a science. So not too much more. I looked up, you know, my Jewish name. There's a site called Forebears, F-O-R-E-B-E-A-R-S, and it has all sorts of information about names. Schiffenbauer is not a very common name, and I always thought one of my first cousins is questioning that. Again, we don't agree, but that I always thought anybody who's Jewish and who's named Schiffenbauer is probably a relative. And we did find out we had relatives in Paraguay and Uruguay and South America. But this forebears website gives, you know, the average income of people named Schiffenbauer. One thing that was quite dismaying was that it's more likely if you're a Schiffenbauer, you'd be a Republican. And very dismaying to me. So anyway, that's about it. I'm sure all of you have stories about how you got your name and whether it was changed or not. I guess that's it for my background.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Marty. I would like to call on Marty Lorber now because he's got a interesting story which relates to your topic. So Marty, can you unmute yourself? Marty is here.
There we go.
There we go. Okay, we got you.
Well, my story was a fairly simple one. You know, my parents carried the, you know, the last name of Nepomnic. And as I was growing up in New York State, I never really gave it much thought. There were some various cousins. My dad was one of four brothers. And we never really thought that much about the names other than it was, number one, it was unique. We didn't know any other Nepomnics other than, you know, members of the family. And then as I was getting older and into high school, I even carried a, you know, the nickname from Nepomnic to Nippy, you know, and when I went to camp, I was, my brother was Big Nipper and I was Little Nipper. And, you know, and I was okay with all of that. But I think it was just about the time that I went to college that I just felt it was, you know, it was kind of cumbersome. The name was either misspelled or mispronounced. And it wasn't that I was that sensitive about it, but I never felt that it was, I knew from the family history, it was not a name that had been in the family for many generations. I felt if the name was something like Rothschild, I would keep it, but it was not Rothschild. So it was just about the time that, you know, of graduating college and going into the military, that I really thought that I was going to change it. And this was in the early 60s. And my biggest concern actually was to not change it while I was still in the military, because I was convinced that I would never be able to get out of the military with a different name. So I waited until 1963, when I did finish my 2 years service in the Army, that I changed. And it actually was remarkably simple. And it was principally simple because I didn't own anything. And, you know, the number of documents that you had to, you know, change were very, very modest. And the only thing that you had to do is you had to publish the name change, just like a business. You had to publish it in some newspaper or some public journal. And at that time, I lived upstate New York, and you know, so the small town or city that I was in, you know, I published it, and for 90 days, you know, it was there, and it said that the name would be changed from Martin Nepomnic to Martin Lorber. Now, the name change, it's interesting in hearing Marty's talk about, you know, how do you, you know, decide on the name. For me, first of all, my parents were not thrilled over the fact that I was going to change my name, my last name. My older brother was kind of neutral about it. But in 1963, I approached my parents and said, I'm going to do this when I'm out of the service and so on. And I said, do you have any suggestions? And they said, well, we understood that we're not really sure if this story is accurate, but we believe that your great-grandfather living in Poland had a name something like Lauber or Lorber. And the story was when he was very young, the Russians, so this would be back in the, in the period of 1840s to really up to, the end of the 19th century. He was inducted into the Russian army as a youth, and they made him into a shoeshine boy. So he kept on, he was being asked, what is your name? What is your name? And he said, rather than Lorber or whatever, he said Nipomnichik, which in the many dialects out in Warsaw and in Poland itself meant I don't understand. So after the same question was asked and the same response was given, whomever was responsible for labeling, my great-grandfather put down Nipomnichik. Well, I thought that story, was a little, bogus. But as it turns out in later years, someone who understood about dialects really confirmed that that was probably an accurate translation from whatever his name was. I approached my parents, as I said, in 1963, and I basically asked them for a name, and they weren't forthcoming. So I said, what do you think of the name Kennedy? Well, my parents were a little apoplectic about that. So I said, okay, we won't do Kennedy. There are a lot of Martin Kennedys anyway. So I ended up, choosing the name, publishing it. And then by that time I was back in graduate school, and it was a little awkward submitting, your work to your professor under two different names. But fortunately, I did end up with my graduate degree in the name of Lorber, and it was all very, very simple. A little addendum is that my older brother, thought, it seemed pretty simple. He said, I'm going to, change my name too. And my parents said, make sure you change it to Lorber and don't pick another one, because it will be too confusing for our friends with, too many different last names. So I did it, and it was interesting when I went back for my 50th college reunion. Mine was the only little tag that had Martin parentheses Nepomnik and Lorber, so it was like different names. But I didn't really meet that many people who remembered me anyway 50 years later, so it didn't make any difference. But I think the final note is that when I am approached, as I was not even a couple of weeks ago, someone approached me and said, oh, your last name is Lorber. Are you related to? And I'd say, stop. I said, I'm not related to anyone named, well, there's Jeff Lorber and the Fusion, and, this is a very nice person. And I said, that's really good to know, but, I do not know. The other thing is that the family, many of the people who did leave, Poland, at that time and escaped to the New World, most of the relatives, as I found out, went down to South America, went down to Argentina. And they changed the name from Nepomnik to Nippon. And and my grandfather, Sam, he was Sam Nepomnik, and he decided to shorten his name to Nippo. And I decided that wasn't going to work for me. So, I did have some possible guidance, but I feel that many, many years later, 60 some odd years later, or 70, 60 years later, I'm comfortable, and, it's up to my kids. If they want to keep the name Lorber, that's fine. They know, the story behind it. So,
well, thank you very much, Marty. That's really interesting and fun story. And I like to see the creativity there, like you don't have to be stuck, with your name.
Break out.
Yeah. So let's see. I wanted to see if we could
Roger, do you hear me? I just wanted to say one.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I forgot I was going to mention when I said those phrases, and the first one, I said, and I was using the word adoshem, and that's by habit. And it's the name for God. And you would say Adonai if you were actually praying. And so it's significant that you're not supposed to say God's name unless you're actually praying. So that's another sort of name thing that we were taught. And if you forgot, you were, you know, hey, what did you do? And it was like some big deal. So that's another aspect of Judaism where you're not supposed to say the name of God.
Yeah, so it's like another one of those taboos on naming, which is a very, very interesting phenomenon. So
Roger,
we just have,
Roger, Irene has her hand up.
Irene, okay. Irene, do you got something for us? Irene Rosen.
Irene, you may have to unmute yourself, Irene. Maybe I can do it.
Okay, yeah, it seems to me my lineage is Russian Jewish, and I think Napomnik means rememberer. So it's not it's not an insulting name necessarily. He's saying something, but I can't hear him.
Yeah, Marty, you're okay.
Thank you for the comment. I actually had the person who spoke the Polish dialects said that, you know, it could be remember, like I don't remember.
Yeah, it's a nice.
But it said more, you know, in the ghetto area, it was often associated with the thought, I don't understand. So to me, it wasn't critical, but I'd like to think that even at a young age, my great-grandfather could, you know, wouldn't be saying I don't remember, but anyway.
Oh, it's not, I don't remember. It's Napomnik would be somebody who does remember. Napom is remember, and then the nik is the Yiddish.
Yeah.
So Irene.
Thank you.
I think. Yeah.
Irene, while you've got the floor, do you want to tell us your story about the Ginsburg name?
Well, yeah, it's kind of funny. I came to New York when I was 5, and there were a lot of Jewish jokes about the name Ginsburg, which was my family name, Ginsburg. And I once heard, I was used to hearing my mother on the phone when she ordered groceries saying, and be sure you send it to Ginsburg. Now that's Ginzberg. And with great pride, she would say that. And then I found out about all the Jewish jokes about Ginsburg. And later on, I acquired a pitcher, a silver pitcher. Somehow that was very special. And it was my grandfather's name, and they were very religious and Jewish and learned and blah, blah, blah. And so that's why she thought that was so wonderful. And later, I got a silver pitcher, and the name engraved on it was Ginsberg, Ginsberg. And I told one of my cousins about this, and he said the engraver was wrong. Must have made a mistake.
Yeah.
So just a funny story.
It's funny the little things that people latch onto, you know, that this is so important, you know. Yeah. So I also wanted to see Shirley Jowl, I think, had a story about her name. Shirley, do you want to unmute and tell us your...
I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. The name Jowl has always interested me. My maternal Yiddish name, Jewish name, was Glasser, which is pretty easy to track down. But Jowell is not a usual Jewish name, except that there are quite a number of other people whose name is Jowl. There was an MP in London whose name was Jowl, England, whose name was Jowl, etc., etc. Now, my tracking is more difficult because my family tried to get into the United States, the story from Latvia, etc., etc., and they were turned away and went on to South Africa. And the records in South Africa are practically nil of people who came through. And both grandparents moved on from Cape Town to Lusaka in Northern Rhodesia. And my fraternal grandfather landed up in Southern Rhodesia. And I've not been able to track where that name came from at all, which means I can't track back to where my family actually came from. So it's just a complication. that's all I can say, is that, you know, the Jewish names landed up all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so that the name Jowl is not a Jewish name.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my story. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Shirley. Is anybody else?
Roger, I have one more quick comment,
yeah. Okay.
Which is kind of interesting. In Orthodox Judaism, Hasidim, the way you refer to God is Hashem, the name. In other words, you say, Baruch Hashem, blessed be the name. So that really takes it all the way.
Right, right. So just the name, he who shall not be named.
Yes.
It's
you
probably
call him, you call God the name.
But it's a he, right?
No, it's not he, it's just Hashem means the name.
Oh, okay. So God isn't necessarily male?
Not in that.
Not in that formula.
Not in that, the way you call him. And I don't, that's a good question. Whether in Judaism, I always thought of God as male, but in that, you know, Hashem in Yiddish and in Hebrew, it's the same thing. It means the name.
Okay. All right. Anybody else want to chime in on the Jewish names before we move on? Unmute yourself. Ella? You got to unmute yourself. Ella, unmute yourself. There you
go. Well, I was just going to say that my name, the name Hurst, is not Hurst. That's my stepfather's name, and his parents' name was Hershkovitz. And, you know, at that time, which was, I was about 11 or 12, I didn't know about anti-Semitism or anything like that, but it just knew that, you know, he said it was for business. And I think that a lot of people did do that. And I did have one very fun thing happen, which was that he wanted me to go to a very fancy private school, and there were not, you know, if you were a layman or a Rothschild or, you know, from Levi Strauss, it was okay. Or if you were Leonard Bernstein's children, it was okay to be there, but anybody else, it was not really okay. And one parent asked me, and she said, "Oh, Hearst, are you related to William Randolph Hearst?" And I said, "No, I'm related to Herman Hershkovitz."
That was it for you.
Yeah, that was it.
Yeah, that's pretty funny. I remember when I was in at Columbia, I was an undergraduate in the early 60s. And a friend of mine, one day he said, "Oh, I got invited to this party. You know, we got to go to this party this weekend. You know, it's going to be great. You know, really good musicians and stuff." And I said, "Well, whose party is it?" And he said, "Oh, it's this guy, Artie Garfunkel." And I said, "Oh, I never heard of him, you know." And so he said, "Yeah, Artie Garfunkel." And I thought, gee, that doesn't sound like a rock star, you know? And so he went over there, and sure enough, it was Artie Garfunkel, which he did go on to become a pretty big star. But my understanding was that in the entertainment business at that time, that many Jewish people changed their names to more waspy sounding names because they thought it would be an avenue to success. And if you went to get an interview for a job or try to get a gig or something, you know, Garfunkel, don't you have any other name? So, I mean, Garfunkel, Simon and Garfunkel, I think actually did pave the way for people with, you know, ethnic names, not just Jewish names, but ethnic names in general, that would be okay. Jerry, did
Roger,
you have
Natalie has her hand up.
Oh, Natalie, okay.
Yeah, I put up a chat, but it may have only gone to Audra. My maternal grandmother's name was Lewis, Lewis, and I was told by a Don at Oxford that the Levines in Wales all changed their name to Lewis during one of the old pogrom. Is that a pogrom? Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah.
And I only knew her as a staunch Methodist, so I don't know what happened along the way, but there sure are lots of Lewises in Wales, I have to say, from cemetery wanderings. So that's all.
Okay, thanks, Natalie. And Jerry, I think, had his hand up.
And Margot's had her hand up. Margot Smith's had her hand up for a long time.
Okay, let's go to Jerry first.
Oh, okay. I used to lecture on Jewish films and the history of Jewish films. And as you know, as Roger just was discussing, there are many, many name changes. And the interesting thing is that the major studios in Hollywood were all basically owned by Jews, but they wanted to Americanize everything that they could. So there were, I don't know, tens, if not dozens of Jewish actors whose names were changed. And I wanted to give you a few of them to give you a flavor of it. You'll guess this one, I think, because of the first name, but he was a noted Broadway actor when he came to Hollywood, and he was an actor in the Yiddish theater, and his name was Muni Weissenfreund, who, of course, became Paul Muni. In that same era, there was a man whose name was Emanuel Goldenberg, who changed his name to Edward G. Robinson. It went on and on. A little later, Betty Persky, who was a model, came to Hollywood, and her name was changed to what? Anybody chime in?
Betty
in fact, her husband never called her by her Hollywood name, always called her by her name, Betty. Her name was changed to Lauren Bacall.
Oh, wow.
Nathan Birnbaum was George Burns. And earlier in the silent days, there was a woman whose name was Theodosia Goodman, which of course had to be simplified. She was a Jewish actress, and her name became Theda Bara. And Bara, interestingly enough, is an anagram, if you turn it around, for Arab, which was considered very exotic in those days. There were two Kaminskis who changed their names, both of them from Brooklyn. Both of them, well, one was a little earlier than the other. One was Danny Kaye, and the other was Mel Brooks. There was and is an actor-director who changed his name, even though it was a perfectly good name. His name was Albert Einstein, and he changed it to Albert Brooks. His brother, Bob, never changed his name, Bob Einstein, but was never quite known as well as Albert Brooks. And of course, there is the famous Jewish man who changed his name to an Italian name. His name was Eric Weiss, and he wasn't in the movies, but the name he changed it to was Harry Houdini.
Wow.
So there was, let me emphasize a point that the Hollywood studio heads and so forth didn't only change Jewish.
We're losing you, Jerry. Did Jerry's connection got broken there, you think, Audrey?
I think so. He's not muted. But Jerry, we can't hear you.
Well, maybe we can go on. You said that somebody else had their hand up, Audrey. Was it Margot Smith?
Margot Smith had her hand up.
Yeah, let's go to Margot, and maybe Jerry can come back. So
and maybe we can go on to Joan, since it's after 4 o'clock now.
Should we go ahead and do that, or?
Well, maybe after Margot.
Okay, all right. So Margot, what do you got for us?
Well, my mother's came from a Jewish family. Her name was Liebman,
and she had a lot of relatives in the Goldman branch, had 4 children, and one of them was Goldberg, and one of them became Colbert, and one of them became Gilbert, and the other one married an Italian Piccarilli, and she became Pick. So I got very interested in name changes.
Yeah.
And I wrote a paper, and you can find it on researchgate.com when I was doing research at the State Health Department. And it's called What's in a Name When People Change Their Name and Birth Date. And we did a study where we compared the names of people in our study with their names on their death certificates. And so about 13% of the men changed their names, which is unusual. You usually don't think of men changing their names, but they do. And it's also cultural. Jews changed their name because they weren't required to have a surname until 1787, when the Kaiser made a law that said Jews had to have last names, and they set up a commission to assign names to people, and people had to pay to get good names. And if they didn't pay, they got a bad name like Schmalz or Eselkopf. And Napoleon said you could not have a name of a place or one that was belonged to an important family. So they had rules. And when I lived in Hawaii, we ran into all sorts of name problems because, like, we had a Samoan family, and say in our summer camp, and if the high chief changed his name, the whole family changed their name. Well, you can imagine what that does to records.
Oh, wow.
Then you had kids who were borrowed by other members of the family, and they'd have one name when they were young and another name when they were older. And then in Polynesia, you also have this thing where if they know your name, you have power over them. So if you have a hula dancer or something like that, they all give you phony names because you don't want to give away your mana or your power.
Okay.
So there's a lot of things. If anyone's interested in reading my paper, I'll be glad to send it to you. Great. Well, thank you very much. A lot of different cultures.
Yeah. Thank you. I think Audrey's right. We should go to Joan because she's got some really interesting stuff for us. And we can come back if people have more to contribute on that topic. But let me just introduce Joan Stramanis. She's a member of Ashby Village and a member of our neighborhood group here, the Outlandish people. And so she has a long list of accomplishments in academia, including president of Antioch College in Ohio. She was the first woman to achieve full professor there and the first female president. And she has a long interest in naming patterns as indicators of social positions, such as social class, ethnicity, and so on. And she's volunteered to give us a few insights about gender and naming practices. And yeah, let's bring Joan on and get her story.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take us in a brand new direction because up until now we've been talking about surnames, last names mostly, and I'm more interested actually I'm interested in all names, but I'm particularly interested in given names. I'm going to get to that in a minute, but meanwhile I want to make a kind of bridge from Marty Schiffenbauer's stories and say a few things about that and connect it with me. We have a lot in common, Marty. You and I are both Jewish atheists, and we're both interested in names, and we both have doctorates. As somebody once said, we don't have the kind of doctorate that does you any good. And you had mentioned the fact, or you conjectured that people named Cohen kept their names because of the prestige involved. My father was a Cohen, and everyone in his family changed their names. And most Cohens I knew changed their names because they didn't want to have a Jewish name for reasons of discrimination. So my father changed his name to Cole. So did his brother, and his sister changed her name to Cowan. So all those Cohens are gone in my father's generation. I thought I'd mention that. And this is an important story for Ashby Village because that's how I came to be a member of Ashby Village, because as you just figured out, my birth name was Joan Cole. And you all know Joan Cole.
Yeah.
Right.
And so I'll tell you very briefly, I was traveling in Cuba and met a woman who had a very unusual surname. And it was the same as someone I had known in high school. So I said, you related to so-and-so? And she said, yes, that's my cousin. And I said, well, tell her that Joan Cole, my name in high school, says hi. And she said, Joan Cole, is your name Joan Cole? I have a friend named Joan Cole in Oakland. So of course, when I got home, since I live in Oakland, when I got home, I immediately looked up Joan Cole. We became friends, and she dragged me into Ashby Village.
Okay.
That's the story, and it has to do with my name, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So, so in any case, I am a Kohen. My father was Cohen, but he changed his name between high school and college to Cole, C-O-L-E. The other thing I want to say about Jewish names is that there's another taboo that wasn't mentioned, and that is among Ashkenazi Jews, you do not name somebody after a living person. Mm. So you do name children after people who have passed away. So those are the practices that I just wanted to underline. I think some of those practices have changed in the very immediate generation, but before that, everyone was named for somebody, but often just the initial. So I was named after my great-grandfather, Jacob, and my name is Joan.
Okay.
Now that is changing, and I want to point that out. For example, my mother's name was Malka, birth name was Malka, and she used the English name Molly her whole life, as did every Malka I knew. But my granddaughter's name is Malka. Mm. So she's not being called Molly, she's being called Malka. So there's a reversion based on ethnic pride. There was an ethnic embarrassment or ethnic concern because of anti-Semitism, but in the current generation, the generation of my children, they are naming their children the ethnic names again, just to recover those names. Mm. And my daughter's name is Rebecca. Mm. So my interest is in naming as a social phenomenon because it's the only element of language that's totally under the control of each generation. And I think that sociologists and anthropologists should pay a lot of attention to names for that reason, because naming practices turn out to be social indicators. If you look at the names being used in any particular ethnic group, you can tell how assimilated they are or how much ethnic pride they have by the naming practices and whether they match those of the dominant culture or not. I'm particularly interested in gender and names, so that's where I'm going now. My interest is in language in general, and I have named a phenomenon called the sex value shift. The sex value shift is a phenomenon of language that in which words, not just names, but words go from the masculine to the neutral, to the feminine, to the pejorative. That's the sex value shift. That's the direction that gendered terms, not just names, go through in the history of language. So for example, I'll give you some examples. The word spinster is a gendered name. It's a gendered word. The ster, S-T-E-R ending is masculine, like gangster and spinster and gangster and other names that end in S-T-E-R. That's gendered masculine, the feminine was spinstress, a person who spins, a woman who spins. So a man who spins was a spinster. Then spinster became neutral for anyone who spins. And then it became feminine, even though it still had the masculine ending. It became feminine that a spinster is a woman who spins. And then it became pejorative because the only people who would be spinning, because it's a very onerous job, would be people who are the unmarried aunt, the maiden aunt in somebody's house, who's given the most menial work, and they have to spin in order to contribute to the family. So that's the history of the word spinster. To me, that's very interesting. And it follows all of the steps in the sex value shift that I've identified. Many, many words do this. So for example, the word sissy originally meant sister. So it went from sissy to a pejorative word, sissy. And the parallel word for brother was buddy. So sissy and buddy were parallel words. They had the same meaning, one for brother and one for sister. You might remember from the Roosevelt White House that there were children named Sissy and Buddy. I don't know if anyone's old enough to remember that, but Sissy and Buddy both had reasonably neutral status, one masculine and one feminine, but Buddy became a more neutral word for and more positive, and Sissy went down in value because it went from feminine to pejorative. Lots and lots of cases. Now let's talk about names. Names follow the sex value shift, not the whole spread, but they go from masculine to neutral to feminine quite often. And in the case of Karen, which is what we started with when Roger sent us a notice about this discussion, it has gone to pejorative.
Yeah.
So, but names like Shirley or Vivian or Leslie, maybe Robin, have gone from the masculine to the neutral to the feminine, not pejorative, let's hope. So, and we find that names are altered according to the sex value shift. They always go from masculine to feminine. They never go from feminine to masculine. I looked and looked when I did research for any names that started out as feminine and became masculine. And the only candidates that you might think of are names like Mario, that might be named for the Virgin Mary, which would have been from feminine to masculine, but it's not true. It turns out that Mario comes from Marius, the Roman name, and not from the Virgin Mary. So there really are no names that I know of that were alterations over history from feminine names to masculine names, but many, many examples of names like mine that went from John to Joan, and names like Roberta that go from Robert to Roberta. That is, the feminine version is an alteration of the masculine version. Now, I'm very interested in the very common recent phenomenon of giving girls very, very neutral surnames as first names. The most common surname in recent years, I mean, the most common given name for girls in recent years is Madison. Madison is not clearly a feminized name, not at all. It's a surname. And many surnames have been given to girls and boys with the thought that these strong names. These are names that have a certain amount of cachet, they have a certain amount of power. This was particularly true in the South, where you find a lot of names like Lindsay and Harper for girls. Mm-hmm. And this might be due to one of two purposes. One might be to carry on a family name when there's no boy in the family. And the other purpose might be to, similar to that, is to memorialize the mother's maiden name. And so the child has both names. But I think that there's a kind of feminist impulse there to give a girl a name that will be either neutral or strong, maybe both. And that's the reason why many families might be naming girls with surnames like Madison and Ashley. Kelly is a name that was used in this way for many years, but some of these other names are much more recent. I'm very interested in a name like Mackenzie. Mackenzie is currently a very common name for girls, and it's clearly a surname. Mm-hmm. And I don't know what the attraction of Mackenzie is, but it's very, very popular right now. And I think it's because it's a feminist impulse to give a girl a name that would be very strong, rather than naming her something like Candy or Bonnie or something like that. Mm-hmm. So there's lots of things that I could say about names. I wrote my dissertation on names. My dissertation is not anything like what I've been talking about today. It has to do with the grammar of names and the what I call the meaning schema of names. You're not interested in this, and I'm not going to burden you with it. My field is philosophy, so this is a dissertation in philosophy of language. So, is that stimulating about first names and the sex value shift?
Yeah, thank you very much, Joan. I wanted to ask
Gail's hand up.
Oh, okay. Audrey, you want to call on Gail?
I just want to make sure, I'm sure you understand, but I just want to make explicit that it's the sex value shift, in that the masculine word is more valuable than the neutral word, which is more valuable than the feminine word, which of course is more valuable than the pejorative.
Okay. Okay, so Audrey, you were calling on Gail?
Yes, Gail is unmuted now, I believe.
I wanted to share an idea for Shirley, who's researching her name. I worked on a project in Joburg, South Africa, and I started to notice a lot of mezuzahs on doors. And I'm like, what's going on? Then I come to find out there's a huge Jewish population in South Africa. So my idea for her is possibly to research through synagogues to see if she can find some information on her family tree, her family name.
Okay.
I hope that helps you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
In fact, you can tell the age of a Jewish person by their name. And Shirley is a retired name, just like Joan is.
No, Shirley was asking about her surname. It was in the conversation previously.
I understand, but I'm going to comment on her given name, Shirley. And Shirley is a very common Jewish name, and it's in a certain generation. You can tell the age of a Shirley because that's a name that's now retired, and it was a name that was given to girls who would otherwise have been named Shira or something like that.
Okay. I wanted to ask Joan about if she could comment about the recent developments among African Americans in their given names, because I find them very imaginative, and I keep running into names that I'd never heard of before. And so you find but then there seemed to be a certain tradition developing, you know, like Latanya has been a name for a while, and there's several of those, but did you have any thoughts about those names?
I do. This is in the same vein as my granddaughter being named Malka. This is ethnic pride. And the people who are naming their children in a certain vein, and they are not historic names. They don't come from Africa. They are made up names, but they're made up with a certain pattern. And the pattern is understood. So they use apostrophes.
Yeah.
And they use a lot of LA in the beginning of the name. And they're not from French. They're totally made up. And this is strictly ethnic pride to choose a name that's clearly in the tradition, the common present day tradition. It's not an old tradition, but it started with girls. And I'm very happy that it spread to boys, because boys were getting names like William and James and you know, common ordinary names, and girls were being named Latasha and whatever. And now I see that the boys are getting those names as well. And to me, that is, again, a feminist impulse, that the boys are being, don't have to be as traditional as they were in the past.
So you don't think that this law and apostrophe stuff relates to the French influence in Louisiana? Because there's certainly...
There may be some trend of that, some degree of that, but I think most of the people who are naming their children with those names are not thinking about French, and they're not thinking about Louisiana. They're thinking about current, present day naming practices to label their children as Black.
Yeah, and I think I would extend that question about the value, because I think in the dominant culture, it's not valued, and so that people complain that if you apply for a job with a name like Latanya, you're jinxing your chances of getting the job. That actually there's a negative from the point of view of the dominant culture.
I think the parents understand that. I don't think they're ignorant of that. I don't think they're naive. I think they're trying to change that. They're trying to say, well, we're proud, and this Black is beautiful. You remember that phrase.
Right.
And that's where it comes from.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you for that. Yeah.
Roger?
Yeah.
Susan Pierpoint has her hand up, and so does Ella.
Okay. Well, you call. You want to call on Susan?
Go ahead, Susan.
Okay. My mother was born in Missouri on a farm, and her name is Ivis. I have never run into another person with that name.
I-V-I-S?
I-V-I-S.
I love it.
And it just, for those of us of a certain age who were part of the women's liberation movement, I just wanted to remember that, you know, I used my maiden name in my profession, never changed it, because I figured marriages might come and go. And and I didn't want to lose my reputation in my job, in my profession. So I think that a lot of us did that. So I took my husband's name because I didn't want a different name from my children. So I've sort of navigated through most of my adult life with two last names, and actually still have two last names. And just one final thing, and that is that my granddaughter is named Ainsley, which is Ainsley, which is Ainsley, a Scottish name, although I'm told that in Scotland it's for boys. So.
And that's the sex value shift. Boys would not be getting names like Genevieve.
Okay. Yeah.
Margaret, first Ella and then Margaret Rossoff.
Well, that makes me think of the Johnny Cash song, A Boy Named Sue.
Right.
But Joan, since your last name is not Cole, Straumanis, where's that from?
Stromanis is my husband's, my second husband's name.
Ah.
I didn't have my head screwed on right, so I didn't take my mother's maiden name, which I now regret, when I married. But that was my husband's name, and it is Latvian. My husband was Latvian, and it's an interesting name because it's a Germanic root. It means straw man, basically Thatcher, and it has a Latvian ending. Stromanis is a Latvian ending on a German name. That tells you something about my husband's ancestry. And the Strauman part means straw man or Thatcher.
Great.
So Margaret Rossoff? Let's see, Margaret, you need to.
Yeah, I just unmuted.
Oh, good. Okay.
So I don't know if people know this book. It looks like it's coming in backwards. My Grandmother's Hands, but it's a somatic psychologist addressing issues of racial trauma. And one of the things he suggests for healing is renaming. So right on, there's a naming and renaming are practical acts of reclamation. And he's basically encouraging Black people to name their kids after their heroes or whatever, you know, made up names. So this is addressing the topic before. If people don't know this book, it's quite powerful. Oh, and he changed his name. So his name is now Resma Menakem. He changed both his first and last name.
And Hillary is another very good example of a surname that's been changed into a given name.
I think Gregory had his hand up.
And then Marty.
Gregory, do you, let's see if you can unmute yourself. Yeah, okay, I'll unmute you. Okay.
Gregory's still muted.
Gregory, can you unmute yourself?
Gregory, if you press,
okay, he's got it.
Okay. And I have some remarks about African names.
We can't hear you. You're too far away from your mic.
Is this any better?
That's better.
Yeah.
Okay. Couple of comments and then segue to some notes on African names. But since Weiss got mentioned, my wife Robin, some of you know, is related to Weisses of the Houdini Weisses. But my mother's name was Liebman, which has also been invoked. And in that situation, they came from a small town near Mannheim. And
Gregory, something happened. We can't hear you anymore. No, we still can't hear you. Did you?
The issue is
That's better.
Is this better?
Yeah.
Okay, maybe I was too close to it. The Liebmans, in this country, Germany, it was spelled with two N's on the end. But I was once in contact with a relative who had not emigrated. He was a Holocaust survivor, moved to Brooklyn, and he kept the second end. His comment was, one circumcision is enough. I wanted to say something about, since I'm an Africa specialist, naming systems in Africa generally, and specifically the part of West Africa where I did research. In much of Africa, given names have to do with circumstances of birth. Famously, day names, days of the week. Many of you will have heard of Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of independent Ghana. Kwame just means Saturday in Han language. And there were also specialized day names. The people I studied, names like Basaga and Pingande, which if you were born on the day of important or close to important harvest Thanksgiving festivals, you got that name. circumstances of birth. One of my main informants was named Yuga, which means cat. And his mother had encountered a cat while in labor. Similarly, if your mother saw a birth, a path, you had a particular name. If your mother encountered a snake when in labor, you got a name. If it was a distinctive name, if your father died before you were born, and if a child followed a sequence of stillbirths or infant deaths, the child gets a particular name, or a whole sequence of such children will get names indicating their place in the sequence. But most of all, what I most wanted to mention was throughout Africa, birth of twins is significant. And sometimes it's a good thing, sometimes it's a bad thing, it's always charged. And it's reinforced by, of course, by the fraught nature of twins with respect to living, because in societies that have high infant mortality to begin with, twins are much less likely to survive because they're smaller. So a great many African cultures have distinctive names, male and female, for twins. Some go further than that, as with sequence of names after twins. The people that I studied in Burkina Faso in West Africa, Somosi, gave distinctive names to the first, second, and third children after twins. The Yoruba of Southwest Nigeria extend the sequence with a distinctive name for a fourth child after twins. And given that the high infant mortality rates, I found it was not unusual when I was taking down genealogies to find that the oldest man in a generation might have a name indicating he was second after twins, suggesting that both the twins and the child after them had not survived, because people without descendants tend to fall out of genealogies. So that was just a thought there. And then what Roger's opening point about distinct variant names, my best friend in graduate school did her research in Barbados and married a Barbadian, and they live in New York. And years after they were married, some friend of Tony's would show up in New York and call up and ask for him under another name because he had a variety of names. That was just a normal thing to have. And his wife would suddenly encounter another name for her husband she had never known. Anyway.
Thank you. Thank you, Gregory. One thing for Joan, I wanted to mention that there's many people of Hispanic background are called Jose Maria Lopez, and that I think might be a feminine to masculine.
And my answer to that was that that will be used as a middle name to honor the Virgin Mary, but never as a first name. So that is an example, yes, and I put that in the chat. So yes, you wouldn't find a boy with the first name Maria, but a middle name, yes, to honor the Virgin.
Okay, Natalie, you have
just a note that it's my son has many Black friends, and I don't know if this comes from them, but he and his wife very carefully named their children with names they found from various pieces of literature. Their older girl is named Zola, Xola, and their younger child is Kamina, Qemina. And so Peter really wanted them, despite his being a school principal, to start their names with X and Q. So I don't know what that's.
And that's an example of what Roger was talking about when he was talking about the creativity. It is not necessary to name a child in that culture a name that's recognizable as a name.
Yeah, and it's also the generation, I think, not just the ethnicity.
Absolutely.
Joe, you had a comment?
I do. I have 3 quick anecdotes, funny anecdotes. My wife's first dentist's name was Dr. Toothacher. My wife, Sarah, has made her career as a soprano soloist, and her maiden name is Heisinger.
Wow.
She probably should have kept her maiden name with hindsight. But my favorite anecdote is a longtime friend of ours who we knew her first as a divorced woman. And she said, my next husband, I'm going to hyphenate the names. And we haven't talked about hyphenated names. And her maiden name was Cox. And she said, I'm going C-O-X. And I'm going to hyphenate the name, and I'm going to take my husband's last name, and hyphenate that. That'll be at the beginning of the hyphenated name, and then her name. That was fine until her husband turned out to be Jerry Long. And it's so much for that idea.
Right.
That's all, just 3 quick stories.
Well, I have a little story. When I married Roger, I had another married name, and that was Loverdi. And when I married Roger, I was trying to think what name. I thought Newman, gee, that's kind of a funny name for a woman. So I thought, well, I could combine the two names, Laverty and Newman. And what I came up was the New Lover Man. But I didn't do that.
Yeah, I think, let's see, I think Marty had his hand up.
Yeah, and Jerry too.
Yeah.
Okay, Marty, you are muted. Can you unmute?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah,
Yeah, you could also hear my phone, unfortunately. Yeah, I just wanted to say with regard to Joan, my wife, who's not Jewish, her name is Kasky, that's her given name, and named after a grandmother whose surname was Kasky. And we always joked, I had a friend whose name was Kasky, a surname, and that if she had married him instead of me, it would have been Kasky. And so another thing is that my stepson had a TV show, and he had originally, it was for Disney, and originally named one of the characters Jesus, which is a common name for Chicanos, and Disney rejected that, thinking it, although it's extremely common, and so they ended up calling the character Seuss rather than Jesus. So again, names are significant. One more thing, for Joan's grandchild, Malka, I'm sure she knows means queen. So that was a clever change.
It means queen in both Hebrew and Yiddish.
Right.
Right. And it was my mother's name and her grandmother's name. And these names go down the generations. It's very good for genealogists because they can follow family trees very much more easily than in other cultures because the names get repeated every other generation.
Thanks. Jerry.
Yeah, a couple of comments and a question for Joan. The name Shirley, which you said is retired, I want to get to that in a minute, but I remember in Herman Wouk's book, Marjorie Morningstar, the main male character, Noel Ehrman, rejects the idea of getting married to Marjorie because he says, I don't want another Shirley, meaning the stereotype of a Jewish middle-class woman, so forth and so on. The other thing is the male to female name. Any female name that ends in ET or ETTE is a diminutive of a male name. And there are many of those, if you can start thinking of them. I have a daughter whose name is Juliet and Charlotte and Antoinette, and it's a diminutive.
It is. It is. And even words are diminutive, like kitchenette and dinette. So I really hate that. I'm sorry about your wife, but anyway, your daughter.
My daughter.
Yeah, your daughter. I think that's.
I'm not. So.
I'm sorry. The name is pretty, but the meaning, the connotation that women are lesser or smaller or cuter is not something I promote.
Well, I agree with that. My question is this: given the retirement of Shirley, names are going in waves. I remember my friend Michael, who Marty and Roger and Audrey know well, 30 plus years ago, thought they came up with the most unusual name, wonderfully unique for their daughter. The name was Ashley, which turned out to be the most common given name for girls of that particular sort of general. So how do you account for fashions in names, and how do you account for names dropping out and names coming in?
Well, it's common sense. People want to name their children something unique, but something they've heard of. So everyone's heard of the same unique name. And then they get to be too common and people stay away from them. And now my name is going through a very interesting change. People my age are named Joan rather than Joanne. But people now, young people especially, like if you go into Starbucks and they ask for your name, and I write Joan on the cup, they'll read it as Joanne. They'll pronounce Joan as Joanne, and they never heard of Joan. Oh. So that they're not very literate. But it seems to me that what's happened in that case is that Joan was once one of the most common names in English in the world. In the 13th century, it was a slang word for woman. But now you won't find any young Joans who are white, but you might find some who are Asian, which is interesting to me. Asians are a generation behind American Asians. I'm talking about Chinese Americans and so on. They're a generation behind, so they will be naming children names that are considered obsolete or old-fashioned by white people.
You know, thank you. Margaret Rossoff has a question, and Susie Bailey has one after Margaret.
So my question was about the diminutives ending in ET. Is Margaret a diminutive of a male name? I don't think so.
Margaret? Oh, yes. Yeah. It's a diminutive.
Of what male name?
Of Margaret, of a male name. No, it's not a diminutive of a male name. It's just a diminutive, like Jeanette and Jean. So it's a diminutive of Margot.
Okay. Margot Smith, I'm your diminutive. Thanks.
So, Susie?
Okay, well, my husband's name is Schuyler, and that is certainly an example. It's a family surname, and it's certainly an example that has now recently become a female name, and with various spellings as well. But his Schuyler, as you can see if you look at our names up there, is Schuyler, and no one can pronounce it. And it has an interesting family history. And I will tell it because I'm the genealogy person in the family. But he's Philip Schuyler Bailey Jr. His father was named Philip Schuyler Bailey, and they were named for General Philip Schuyler, who was a famous Revolutionary War general and a US senator, and lived in Albany, New York. And they thought they were descended from him, and in the family lore was his picture hung in somebody's house. And then I came along, and of course his grandfather had done a whole genealogy. There was a huge Schuyler family tree that showed all the Schuylers and all the descents and all of that. But they didn't have the internet, and they didn't look very closely at the family tree. And his genealogy says, we haven't traced the line, but if you looked at the family tree, there were two Philip Schuylers, and one was the general and one was a generation before. And it was very clear that they were descended from one from the generation before and not from the general. And then I looked more on the internet and found out more about that family. The first Schuyler came in 1650 and settled in Albany from Holland. And he bought land along the Hudson River outside of Albany, New York. And we went there. Sky, my husband, we call him Sky. He stood on the land on where the house had been, the foundation of the house, and a beautiful, beautiful big park. And in New York, you see Schuyler in that part of New York all over the place. Schuyler Inn and Schuyler this and Schuyler that. But no one here knows how to even pronounce the name. Schuler, and other things. But and more now because of this trend towards naming girls Schuyler. But at any rate, it was interesting to me to just go on. Yes, Joan?
And Bailey.
And Bailey, yes, that's true too. But it was interesting to me to see how this all developed. And especially now because General Philip Schuyler's daughter was Eliza Schuyler, and she married Alexander Hamilton of the musical Hamilton fame. We have granddaughters who knew the music and ran around talking about the Schuyler sisters. I finally said, you're the third cousin 8 times removed from Eliza Schuyler. So anyway, just a little family story.
Thank you. Oh, Sam Duncan. Yes, can you unmute yourself? Let's see.
Sam, you need to unmute yourself.
An easy way to unmute is to press the space bar.
Sam, we can't hear you. You have to unmute.
Okay.
Good,
that's better. Yeah. I was sorry that when Gregory was talking about African names in relation to things that happened around birth, but unfortunately, doctor's office called me, so I didn't hear any of that. So I'm wondering this. I have an example of that, but I don't know if that's appropriate for this particular topic.
Sure, go ahead, Sam. That's fine.
That's okay?
Sure.
Make it very quick. I worked in the Congo for 10 years, teaching math and physics at the branch of the university. And I made a really good friend there. And his name was Noah, just a regular N-O-A-H, Diawaku. And so he was kind enough to tell me what that meant. And the name Diawaku means eat your own, in the Kikongo language. And, I didn't know what that meant. I mean, saying, eat your own, what does that mean? Well, he told me that his parents had been through 2 infant deaths. And in some parts of the Congo, there was a belief that somebody, when there's a death that has occurred, it's always been occurred intentionally. And somebody has eaten the life of the deceased in order to gain more strength for themselves. So I understand it. I understood that. And so his parents, who had 2 lost children, they decided to give their next child the name of Diawaku. And as I said, that means eat your own. So once they laid out that name, because it means eat your own, that name would be essentially telling somebody who might want to eat your child, what they would be reacting to is that instead of eating, their child, it would say essentially, go eat your own child, not mine. And the good part is it worked. And he did. He lived a long and happy life with several outstanding children. So it worked.
That's kind of like a poison pill.
Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah.
That's right.
Don't
mess with me.
It's almost 5 o'clock, and I want to thank all of you and Roger for coming up with the idea and spearheading it, and all of you for contributing your stories. It's just, for me, it's been fascinating. Joan and Marty and had prepared contributions, but everybody else was extemporaneous, and I really appreciate that. So thank you very much. Before we sign off, I just want to say that next month, in February, the second Wednesday, we're going to have a woman who is a powerhouse in energy innovation. She's going to talk to us about how, what kinds of energy generation we can count on, and what's possible, what's not possible, and so on. So I hope you will join us next month in February. I think it's the 10th.
Okay, well, thank you, Audrey.
My birthday.
Thank you very much. It was great. Thank you, both of you, and everybody else.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. Very, very good. Always.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you.